Hello, this is Ipo Swords, and today we're going to be talking about this, a French model of 1882 French infantry officer's sword. This is a rare and unique custom-made variant of the 1882, and in fact its blade shares more with the design of the 1896 cavalry sword, adopted in 1896 as the name suggests, across both branches of the French cavalry, light and heavy cavalry. In order to fully appreciate the design of this sword, we must first understand a little bit of history. In the early 1880s, the French was experimenting with a new method of converting their old 1822 cavalry sabres, which were of course curved, into a straight model which could be used in their new thrust-centric system. In order to do this, they would reforge the blades until they were straight, and then temper them. However, something went wrong, and these 1822 transformed blades, as they were known, were prone to breakage and were never actually adopted. Therefore, there was no new model of cavalry sword until 1896, where both branches of the military, light and heavy cavalry, were given a new sword. It had this blade, with a single edge, a single fuller, and a thick spine at the tang that tapered towards a very acute point. In essence, the perfect thrusting blade. Because it's relatively stiff, and because it's relatively long, this sword was extremely effective at penetrating the sort of opponents that you would find at the turn of the century, wearing what was essentially a greatcoat and a uniform below it. This example, however, as I mentioned, is made for an infantry officer, as the hilt defines what branch of the military a sword would be made for. Having said that, this is not entirely a standard hilt for an 1822, as you might have guessed by the fact that it's bronze. The standard 1882 had a German silver hilt, which was silver in colour as the name would suggest. This one used the classic bronze alloy. I believe this one in fact used acro, which contained carbon as well, and has a distinct reddish discoloration as it patinas. Beyond the material used to make this sword hilt, there are also design element changes between this and the standard variant. The first is an extra external bar on the grip, and the second is the presence of two internal bars on the hilt. By increasing the protection on both the outside and inside of the hand, you can increase the effectiveness when giving point with a sword like this, as you protect more of the hand. This is suited to cavalry use and makes sense for a cavalry sword, but as said, this is for an infantry officer. I would therefore make the hypothesis that this was for a mounted infantry officer, a wealthy officer who could afford to have a horse despite being in an infantry allocation. This horse would not have been used to charge the enemy, but simply to get a better perspective on the battlefield with better visibility, and also to make it easier to march long distances, as he no longer had to use his legs. This 1882 is therefore an 1882 with an 1896 blade. However, this is not a standard blade either. It's not made in Klingenthal, and it is definitely not made by the Coulard brothers. Instead, this sword is made by Barre and Fils from Paris, that is, Barre and Sons in Paris, an outfitter who supplied both hilts and blades to officers who had the money to pay for it. He was one of the more expensive outfitters of the time, with some of his design being extremely decorated. This one is rather sparse in decoration, but it more than makes up for that in custom features on the guard and on the blade. I posit that this was made around the turn of the century, and because of that it was never used in anger. After the turn of the century, the first conflict in which the French were engaged was World War I, and the sword was not the primary weapon of a cavalryman or an infantryman at the time. A cavalryman would prefer a carbine or a pistol depending on whether he was a trooper or an officer, and an infantryman would definitely prefer a musket or a pistol depending on whether they were, again, a private or an officer. In this case, I expect that the officer who carried this would have much preferred to use his pistol than rely on a sword. Having said that, if this were to be used in combat, you would expect it to be field sharpened, but this one is completely blunt. Now, despite the fact that this particular example has no combat pedigree, we can at least comment on the design features. Because it has a more protective guard and a longer and different blade to the standard model, this sword actually weighs a considerable amount more. Our standard model weighed 690 grams, whereas this one weighs a considerably hefty 820 grams, a difference of 130 grams overall. It's also a couple of centimeters longer, being 104.5 centimeters long, making this a B-sized blade compared to the C-sized blade of the presentation sword we looked at earlier in the week. I've made a few conjectures in this video that this was probably for a mounted officer. However, as per usual, take the disclaimer that I cannot prove this. It is simply a hypothesis based on the design and materials this sword has used. This has been a quick video on an 1882 variant. I hope you've enjoyed this video and the entire series. Until next time, stay sharp.